oppressed, suppressed, and contained within the land. In other words, he didn't want them to exit the womb. If the Creator's purpose is to bring them out of the womb, so to speak, what did the adversary want to do? Abort them. Stop that from happening. He does not want this child to be born. Pharaoh doesn't want them to go up out of the land. And so he implements these policies. The first are the taskmasters, which really could be rendered tax masters. He exacted all these heavy taxes from them first and foremost to put them in a very vulnerable and weak position. Then the Egyptians made their lives bitter with all this hard labor. Then he began to develop a plan of destroying the Hebrew males, or the seed. And later they're going to throw Hebrew males into the river. All of that was designed to keep them in the land, keep them in the womb, which is in direct defiance of what the Creator's calling for them to come up out of the land. Go to Acts chapter 7. Everybody still with me here? Yeah. All right. Let's see, Acts chapter 7. Stephen is addressing the people. Let's see, verse 14, he says, Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all of his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people, oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. Of course, that was the time that Moses was born. But here's the point I wanted to make. What Stephen basically tells us here is that the reason this king came to power in Exodus chapter 1 was because the time was drawing near to the promise that God had sworn to Abraham to come to pass. And what was the promise? That after 400 years,
they'd inherit.
He was going to bring them out of Egypt. He was going to bring them into the land. So, the reason that king came to power was because it was time for that to happen. Notice the king that came to power is trying to keep them in the land, even though God's purposes for him coming to power is so that they'll come out of it. So what does that tell me? It tells me that as he looked upon his people when this time was approaching, that not only had they been living in Egypt, but Egypt had been living in them. They had assimilated into Egyptian culture. Because eventually all the folks who leave Egypt to go to Canaan, how many of them were born in Canaan? As far as we know, none. Including Moses. They were all born in Egypt. So Egypt is what they are familiar with, what they're comfortable with. That's their surroundings. That's where they've been nurtured. That's where they've been protected, just like the baby in the womb. And so guess what? A baby would probably be very content to just stay right there in the womb. But the way the Creator designed it is, water breaks, and then what happens, ladies? Labor, travail. And that child is going to go into a lot of stress. You're going to go into travail. It's the Creator's way, more or less, of forcing the baby to leave the womb. Because he knows if he stays, he'll die. If this king doesn't come to power in Exodus 1, and Moses shows up under those circumstances to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt to Canaan, how many of them want to leave? No. Knowing this, what does the Creator do? He allows darkness to descend upon the land. And on the surface, most people, all they see is the darkness, the evil, the wickedness, the king and everything that he's doing. But the very reason he came to power was because the time was drawing near for the promise that God had sworn to Abraham to come to pass. The Creator is the one who allowed him to come to power. And so even though this wicked king pursues his own agenda, what we see is in his pursuit of his agenda is simply serving God's purposes. Because if God doesn't allow that man to come to power, Israel doesn't want to leave Egypt. And so they're going to continue to assimilate into Egyptian culture to such a degree that at some point Israel ceases to exist. Because they have just melted in and become Egyptians. Israel, the child, would have died in the womb. And so what does the Creator do? He kind of forces the issue. He provokes them. Travail, plagues, birth pangs. In fact, later on, and we won't go into this tonight, but later on in Exodus 14, he actually causes them to go down into the birth canal. It's just, in Exodus 14, the way it reads, he causes them to go to a place on the edge of the Red Sea called the Mouth of the Gorges. Well, if you end up at a place called the Mouth of the Gorges, that means you've had to go through a gorge. And a gorge is basically a ravine, a canyon, or let's put it this way, a straight, narrow path. A birth canal. Where they pass through the water. Right?
Wow.
In Isaiah 11, he says, I have called my son out of Egypt. But, again, the main point is, darkness is what provoked this. Light comes out of darkness. In fact, let's go back to Genesis 1. Verse 4. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. Now, two words here. Well, yeah, two words. The one is good. Does anybody know the Hebrew word for good?
Tov.
Tov. All right, that's the Hebrew word for good. Now, when we say something good, or something is good, what do we mean by it? Exactly. It means it's really dependent on the context, isn't it? Good is something that's positive. Or if you're contrasting it against evil, you know, it's the opposite of evil. Well, what is evil?
Not good. It's not good.
All right. So when we look at this word in Hebrew, and we put it as in the context of the very first time it appears in Scripture, it's in regard to the light. He says, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that it was good. It was tov. I want to suggest to you that in Hebrew what this word is really saying is, at that point in time, the light was functioning in its purpose. It was serving its purpose. And when you compare other days of creation, for instance, day 2 creation, you will not see that he says, and it was good. That's the day he stretched out the firmament, he divided the waters above from the waters below. It doesn't say that it was good. Why?
I have a theory on it.
Let's hear your theory.
That's when he created the angels, and that's when Lucifer was created. And so it wasn't perfect. Lucifer wasn't perfect.
Perhaps. I don't know. Here's my theory. All right? Because the firmament divides the waters above from the waters below, right? Okay? What the waters are to, or the function the waters are to serve, has not yet come into fruition until the next day. Because on the next day, day 3, what does he say? Let the seas, or let the waters be gathered together unto one place. And he called that seas. And when that happened, what happens? The dry land appears that he calls earth. And then he's going to call forth the vegetation. So at that point, the waters, at least beneath the firmament, are in their affixed position, where they're supposed to be, functioning in their purpose. And then he says, it's good. So what I'm getting at is, tov, or good, is really defining something that is serving its purpose, functioning the way the Creator intended it to function. That's good. Right? So if that's the word that defines those things that are functioning according to His purposes, what do you think the word would be for those things that are not functioning in their purposes? Well, what's the opposite of good? Bad or evil. Yeah. See, wicked, evil, bad, as opposed to what's right, what's good, what's holy, is much broader than devil worshippers and baby killers and things like that. It's those things that the Creator has designed for a particular purpose, designed for a specific reason, and then it doesn't function according to that purpose. And who plays the greater role in making sure that, or who plays the greater role in corrupting His purposes?
Man.
Man. We learned it from the adversary, but we're really the ones who are complicit in all this. Because, for instance, in Genesis chapter 6, we know that the floodwaters were upon the earth and destroyed every living thing, right? Say what was on the ark with Noah. And who gets the blame for that in the scriptures? Mankind. In Genesis 6 verse 11 said, the Lord God looked upon the earth, and it was corrupt, and Hamas, or violence, was in the earth. And it was corrupt because all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. So, back to good, it is to describe something that's functioning in its purpose. And so once again, if that's correct, then evil would be the word that describes those things that are not functioning in its purpose. Now, light has a purpose. Darkness has a purpose. And so, what did He do? He divided the light from the darkness. Isn't that what it says? He divides the light from the darkness. So, Bet Dalet Lamed is the verb, but Dalet means to divide or to separate. So you distinguish the light from the darkness. Now, it's going to be interesting upside down. What I've done is I've added the letter Hey to the beginning of the verb, and I've added the letter Hey at the end of the verb. And so consequently, Badal becomes Havdalah. You ever heard of that word before? You have, a couple others have. Tell me what Havdalah is.
Well, it's the end of it. It's what we do at the end of this house.
Right. At the beginning of Shabbat, do any of you follow the custom of kindling lights at the beginning of Shabbat?
Yeah.
Okay? So on Erev Shabbat, the custom is you kindle lights. At the end of Shabbat, the custom is, it's not a commandment, the custom is you have Havdalah, what we did last night, right? And Havdalah comes from a word, this word here, that means to divide. Because Havdalah is the end of Shabbat. And so we are distinguishing Shabbat from the rest of the week. And so the prayer of Havdalah is, Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who teaches us to distinguish between the holy and the profane, between light and darkness. But in the context of Shabbat, separating Shabbat from the rest of the week, what is light and what is darkness? Do you understand my question? In the context of Shabbat, being set apart from the rest of the week, right? What is light of those two? And what would be darkness of those two? Shabbat is light, the rest of the week is darkness. In the same scenario, what is considered holy and what would be considered profane? Shabbat would be considered holy, the rest of the week would be considered profane. Now, as people who are pursuing our Hebrew roots and Messianic or whatever we are.
The awakened ones.
The awakened ones. When we think of profane things, what do we typically think of? Things that we don't have that have nothing to do with, right? And yet, in the context of Shabbat, as opposed to the rest of the week, Shabbat's considered holy. It's set apart. That we do know from the Scripture. He blessed it, He hallowed it, He set it apart. Which means it's holy, and the rest of the week is profane. If it represents light, the rest of the week represents darkness. Now, here's my question. Do those other 6 days serve a purpose? Yes, they do. Because who established those 6 days? He did. To serve a purpose. And if you observe Shabbat, what do you do most of those 6 days?
Or
Besides work.
Prepare.
Prepare for
Shabbat.
So might it be true that those 6 days, which are considered to be darkness, as opposed to Shabbat, considered to be profane compared to Shabbat, not only serve the purpose of providing us an opportunity to work and make a living, but also provoke us to look to what is light. To provoke us to look to what is holy. He uses darkness to provoke us to seek Him. Seek, and you will find. Ask, and it will be given. Knock, and the door will be open. But how many of us would admit that even as believers, it is not really our nature to just automatically fall in line and get in gear with anything and everything He wants us to do? How many of us would admit that? How many of you are like me that in your walk, He's had to provoke me along the way? And typically what He uses to provoke me are those circumstances, sometimes consequences, darkness, profane, whatever you want to call it. He uses those things to provoke us to seek. So He uses profane things, He uses darkness to provoke us to look to the light, to come out of darkness into His marvelous light. That's what I'm getting. So then, I don't know where you stand politically, and I don't care, but let me just say this. I think we would all agree that in our country and the world, that darkness is most definitely settling on the land. Doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal, that's immaterial. Because quite frankly, I don't think the creator's a card-carrying Democrat, and I don't think he's a Republican either. All right? Because all those things are man-made anyway. But I do believe that darkness is coming upon the land. Darkness is coming upon the world. Do you agree?
Yes.
Do you have the idea that things, depending on who gets elected next November, are going to get better? No, I don't think it's going to matter if it's a Democrat or Republican. His purposes are still going to carry forward. So my point is, if darkness is descending upon the land, number one, who forms or who creates the darkness from the beginning? And if He creates the darkness, doesn't He do it for a purpose? And if it's for a purpose, it's to serve His purpose. And if He has in times past used darkness to provoke His people to look to what is holy, to look to what is light, might it be that He will use darkness once again to accomplish the same goal?
Absolutely.
And so if that's the case, then what does it say of us?
That we're being provoked.
Let's use this. I'm assuming anyway, all Americans here, and forgive me if I'm wrong in that assumption. But we're all here, and this nation, this culture, and this society has been where most of us were born. It's been where most of us have grown up, where most of us have been nurtured, prospered, where we've been protected, we've taken form, you know, all those different things that we can say the same of Israel when they were in Egypt. But was it ever meant that Israel, the baby, would always stay in Egypt?
No.
In fact, didn't we agree, or at least I did, myself, that had Israel stayed in Egypt, what would have happened? They would have died. So if this is the womb, and if this is the place where He has chosen that we grow, that we mature, we take shape, we take form, that we prosper, that we are nurtured, it would seem to me that there's going to come a time that if we stay, and I don't mean in a geographical sense necessarily, but if we stay plugged into this culture, most importantly with our heart, with our mind, our consciousness, if we stay plugged into our culture and refuse to come out of it and to be a separate people, then what's going to happen? Most of His people would be quite content to stay plugged in. Would you agree?
Yes.
So guess what He's going to
And
do? He's going to use darkness to do what? To provoke us to look to what is light, to what is holy. And birth pains, travail, all of those things that are intended not to destroy His people, but actually are intended to restore and to preserve His people. Because what we perceive as the end of the road, like when they were in the wilderness and they went down into the gorge, 2 to 3 million people they estimate, and they go down into the gorge, and as they're going and being pressed and squeezed down into that, what I would call the birth canal, I guarantee you there were people at the back thinking this does not look like the right way. And then, guarantee you. And then when they get to the end of the gorge, and it opens up, and they're thinking, okay, we're coming out of the gorge. And then when they get out of the gorge, what do they see in front of them? The Red Sea. And that's when Edward G. Robinson stands up, remember? The young people don't know who that is.
Or dating or something.
Go watch the movie. But, you know, that's when they're saying, you know, were there no graves in Egypt that you called us out of this wilderness to die? They think that's the end of the line. They perceive that we're dead. They perceive that Moses has led us into a death trap. Or they perceive God has led them into a death trap. Even Pharaoh says, the wilderness has shut them in. But what they perceived as death, turns out it was the only way that led to life. And it ends up actually being Pharaoh's death trap. So, again, all this is to say that if darkness is coming upon the world, and I think that's evident, then what's the purpose? It's to provoke us to look to those things that are light, to look to those things that are holy, and to, in doing that, to come out of, and again, I'm not speaking geographically necessarily, because you could leave a place physically, go to a different geographical location, but your heart still be where you left. Remember Lot's wife. So most importantly, I'm talking about, how shall I put this? I don't want to hang on to something that is going to end up being his footstool. I don't want that to become the most important thing to me. Revelation, we're told, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of His Messiah. And please notice, it does not say except one. So I don't want something that is destined to become His footstool to be the most important thing to me. I don't want what I want to be the most important thing to me, because that's really what it boils down to. I'll kind of reveal where I'm at in some things. You see, if I had my way, Ronald Reagan would still be president. He'd still be president. I know, we'll prop him up. That's how
Pocket for him anyway.
you know, if I had my way, you know, we'd have 24 hours of reruns of Andy Griffith, you know, 7 days a week. That's if I had my way. Dean Martin would still be on the radio all the time, you know, if I had my way. But you see, what that really says, what I'm really saying is, if I had my way, things would just go on like they always have been. If I had my way, we'd go back to when everything was comfortable, safe, everything that I was familiar with, that gave me the warm fuzzies, right? If I had my way.
That's right.
But if I stay there in the womb,
Right.
I die.
Yeah.
So it's not supposed to be what I want, or what you want, or what we want. It's supposed to be about what are His purposes. And so my responsibility then becomes, as these things come upon the earth, as these things happen in our communities, and even in our families, how do I respond to it? And the response should be, if it were possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Going back to Shabbat, comparing it to the rest of the work week. Again, Abdallah is a custom that where we distinguish Shabbat from the rest of the week. We say, you're teaching us to distinguish light from darkness, the holy from the profane. The sixth day of creation, with the creation of man, you understand that is not the pinnacle of creation, right?
Right.
That is not the pinnacle of creation. The seventh day is the capstone of creation. Because the creation week is not complete until what? The seventh day. So that's the pinnacle, Shabbat. So Shabbat has a purpose as it relates to the whole creation account and the picture that it paints for us of the future. So Shabbat has a purpose. So then, if Shabbat, before Shabbat, to serve its purpose means that something has to come to an end. What is that? The week in which we do what? Work. So for Shabbat to serve its purpose, work has to come to an end. For Shabbat to serve its purpose, there are things that must come to an end. If Shabbat is a picture of something later on, ultimately what? When the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of His Messiah. If that is what Shabbat is a picture of, for that to come into fruition, to serve its purpose, that means what? That some things, kingdoms, have to come to an end. And so while we're spread out all over the earth in all these different kingdoms, and that's what we're comfortable with, that's what we're familiar with, that's what we feel comfortable with, that's what we, that's everything we've ever known. To provoke us to look to His purpose, what is He going to have to do?
Make it uncomfortable.
Make our water break.
So darkness comes. But just because it's darkness doesn't mean that it's absence of His presence, or absent of His presence. I can't go up to heaven and Him not be there, but I can't go down to Sheol and find that He's not there either. He's everywhere and He's in everything. Is it all right if I take about 20 or so more minutes? Is that okay? All right. I know that your husband's got to get up, and I know that others do as well. But let me, let's go to Genesis chapter 12 real quick. Yes, please. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of this. I'm just going to share a few highlights in Genesis 12. Now, everybody knows that, well, at this point he's called Avram, but later he's going to be called Abraham. And everybody realizes, I hope, that Abraham, or Abraham, is our spiritual father. Right? Everybody understands that? Because Galatians 3 tells us that there is one seed of Abraham, not seeds as of many, but one, and that seed is Messiah. But then we're told in verse 29 that if you are Messiahs, that you are the seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. So, again, Abraham is the spiritual father to all those of faith. So, when we look to Abraham, we see an example of what we should do and even what we shouldn't do. When we look to Abraham, we also see a picture that's being told of what we can expect to happen to us, being the seed of Abraham. Because what happens to the fathers happens to the children. In fact, Messiah even hinted at this. He said to a group of people who were the physical descendants of Abraham, he said to them, if you